This audio presentation of Hi Dad is brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction. Written by Herbert Ewing Duncan. Executive producers: Scottish Rite Grand Commander James D. Cole, 33rd degree. Grand Master of DeMolay John Sellars and DeMolay Grand Secretary Stephen E. Crane. Narrated and produced by Matt Bowers, 32nd degree. Consulting producer Dean Alban, 33rd degree. Hi Dad Book, copyright 1981. Audio recordings copyright 2023. All rights reserved. For information on how you can donate to support this audio serial, visit DeMolay.org. Chapter 7. Designs on the Trestle Board. There is an ancient legend telling of a master builder who made a practice of entering the cathedral he was constructing during the quiet time of the noon hour of each day as the craftsmen were taking time for refreshment. There he would first offer a prayer seeking the guidance of the great architect. Then he would proceed to draw designs on the trestle board. It was from the designs created in this manner that the workmen could carry to completion the work of building. They could carve in stone and bend the arches of support to give meaning, beauty, strength, and symbolism to their work. Frank Land, in his hours of meditation, now saw the necessity of forming a guiding organization for the expanding horizon of DeMolay. He realized the pressing need of drawing designs on the trestle board so that the chapters of his order might have direction and unity of operation. He turned to Alexander G. Cochran for advice and help. Judge Cochran, in 1920, represented the strength of the Masonic Order in Missouri as the Sovereign Grand Inspector General of the Scottish Rite of the Southern Jurisdiction. He was a powerful man both in ability and in stature. He had been admitted to the bar when only 19 years of age and practiced law for 8 years in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In the year of 1874, he was elected to serve as a member of the United States Congress, and on his retirement from that office had moved to St. Louis, where the Missouri Pacific Railroad used his talents for many years as their general solicitor. President Taft had once suggested his name for a vacancy on the Supreme Court, but under pressure from the opposing political party had reluctantly withdrawn his name for nomination. Judge Cochran had watched the formation of the Order of DeMolay and on November 8, 1919, held a meeting of the Mother Chapter. He became an enthusiastic sponsor. The boys were a bit awed by his presence and his air of the pompous, but gave to him, at that meeting, the title of Grand Commander. Grand Champion might have been a more appropriate title, for he gave his leadership and guidance to youth from that time until his death, serving as Grand Master of DeMolay from 1921 to 1928. The two men met in St. Louis while attending a conference in the autumn of 1920. Judge Cochran said, "Frank, in all of fraternal history, there has never been anything like this. How many chapters have been formed since the beginning? As I remember, only 18 months ago. There are now approximately 50 chapters. The indication is that within another year, this figure might soar to almost 500. Each day brings inquiries from all over the nation." Cochran shook his head. "It is about what I thought. How do you expect to control this growth? You can't do it alone. Oh, I know you have good sponsorship and a group of men who work with you in Kansas City, but this is not enough. There must be a governing body to take in these advisors of yours as well as the key men in the various states where you have chapters. Unless you have such a controlling group, so help me, you will find others taking over your ritual and changing it at will. Similar groups will be formed without your consent, and, unless I am mistaken, you will be subjected to all kinds of criticism as an individual. There are always the jealous, the envious, who without hesitation will nail the hide of a successful man to the barn door. These things have already taken place, except the last, for my hide is still intact," Frank replied. "For example, in one of the northern states, a boys' group has just been formed that is similar to DeMolay, even to a ritual almost identical to ours. But what can we do? As for myself, I have received all sorts of negative letters in an effort to tear me down. Some of them suggest I am getting rich from DeMolay, others indicating fraud in selling DeMolay jewelry. I have even been accused of immoral conduct. These all hurt, but the important thing is to keep DeMolay as an entity. You are right, Judge. I have thought many times of this, and from our talk today, I am convinced we should have a guiding group to be the central and controlling force for DeMolay. From this conversation, the designs of an organization grew. A formative meeting was held on November 20th, 1920, at the Baltimore Hotel in Kansas City, with Land and Cochran leading the discussion with local leaders. Committees were appointed to write a constitution, to designate special days for observance by all chapters, to make plans and agenda for the first meeting of what was to be known as the Grand Council of the Order of DeMolay for Boys. Frank Land was possessed with a remarkable sense of the beautiful, the use of space, and a dramatic presentation in all things. Now he prepared the auditorium of the Scottish Rite Temple in Kansas City for the first meeting of the Grand Council held on March 7th and 8th of 1921. First, the floor area was cleared of all seating. Then a DeMolay altar with a covering of white satin on which had been embroidered the DeMolay emblem was placed in front of the steps leading to the stage. On the altar, he placed an open Bible with a marker of velvet. A few schoolbooks bound with a leather strap were placed on one corner. Roses and carnations were placed to give color to the settings. A stage curtain of simple color and design was used as a backdrop for the meeting. Perhaps he remembered the Round Table of King Arthur, for he arranged tables in such a manner as to form a great hollow ellipse and covered them with deep green felt. At the head of this table and a few paces from the altar was a heavily carved, high-backed chair with arms and a cushion of embossed fabric. This was for Alexander Cochran, who had been selected to serve as the temporary Grand Master and to preside over the meetings. Smaller chairs were placed about the table with name cards to indicate where each man was to sit. Land, as acting scribe, was seated to the right of the Grand Master. There was an atmosphere of destiny in the room as the men took their places, for each was dedicated to his new youth movement and realized that every act, every word, and every decision of this group would influence and give tradition for all the years of the future. Judge Cochran opened the meeting, and then Frank Land addressed the group, saying, "You are the men who have been with me from the very beginning. You have seen a group of 9 boys grow into a membership of thousands. The interest you have taken, your willingness to give of your time and your influence has made this growth possible. You are all dedicated men interested in helping boys grow into manhood with a respect for God, for country, and an appreciation for home. We have worked together and have founded here in this city something of such importance that it is now shared by groups throughout the nation. We take pride in what has been done. Now, through necessity, it is our obligation to create a governing group to bring unity of ritual and forms of procedure by which chapters from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from Texas to Minnesota may operate. I ask each of you to accept the role you will assume as the first members of this Grand Council with the same dedication and willingness to serve DeMolay as you have so beautifully shown in the past. Before we enter into the business of the day, let us follow the tradition of Masonry by offering a prayer." All of the men invited to this formative meeting were present except John A. Glazier and Harry I. Salisbury. Those present were Alexander G. Cochran, Fred O. Wood, Raymond D. Havens, Percy A. Budd, Alexander MacDonald, Arthur S. Metzger, Frank S. Land, Ellis R. Jones, Frank I. Buckingham, Frank A. Marshall, William P. Osgood. During this session, Fred O. Wood moved that the following men should be elected to serve as members of the First Grand Council: Richard H. Malone of Colorado, Zorro D. Clark of Omaha, Nebraska, D. Clark Kelly of Kansas, Edward Ashley of South Dakota, Jesse Meggs Whited of Northern California, Jesse Alden West of Iowa. All of these, with the exception of Edward Ashley and Jesse Alden West, were in attendance, making a total attendance of 15 for the 2-day session. The first order of business was a report from a formation committee that had been appointed during the preliminary meeting of November 20th. Each member present had been made familiar with the material presented and enthusiastically endorsed the provisions of the first Constitution and Statutes of Order. This document provided for the expansion of the membership of the Grand Council by including those who would serve as jurisdictional officers in the various states where DeMolay chapters would be formed. A restriction on such members, however, was made by limiting the membership to a maximum of 50. There was an understanding that when this number was reached and a jurisdictional officer was qualified, the Kansas City men would resign to make membership available. The statutes provided for a fiscal year to end on January 31st. To finance the Order of DeMolay, a provision was made that the scribe of each chapter should remit to the Grand Scribe the sum of 50 cents for each candidate receiving the initiatory degree, and an additional fee of 50 cents for a patent of membership for each candidate receiving both degrees. In addition, there was a provision that every chapter should, annually, before the 31st of January, remit to the Grand Scribe the sum of 15 cents for each of its members shown upon its rolls on the last day of January. 52 chapters had been instituted and were now granted charters as provided by the new Constitution. Charter number 1 was issued to the Kansas City chapter, recognized as the mother chapter of the world. Charter number 2 was issued to Huron chapter of Kansas City, Kansas, and Charter number 3 was issued to Pittsburgh chapter of Pittsburgh, Kansas. The total membership of the 52 chapters was reported as being 3,336. Officers were elected as the next order of business. Each man was elected with appreciation for his outstanding help during his brief history of DeMolay. They were Grand Master Alexander G. Cochran, Deputy Grand Master John H. Glazier, Grand Senior Counselor Fred O. Wood, Grand Junior Counselor Raymond M. Havens, Grand Treasurer Percy A. Budd, Grand Scribe Frank S. Land. Dad Land, from the very beginning, told his boys that they should reach out beyond their own activities and be of help to others. Now, through a special committee, with Frank I. Buckingham as chairman, certain days were selected as the time to render such services by all chapters. The Grand Council voted to adopt them as a vital part of the organization. They believed in them so strongly that they gave them the name of obligatory days. The days selected were to be observed as Patriots' Day, Parents' Day, DeMolay Day of Comfort, Devotional Day, and Education Day. The very names indicate the elements of life that were important to the Founding Fathers and those facets of society that, in their opinion, should never vanish from a worthwhile society. The Day of Comfort was to be observed on the 3rd day of January by the members visiting hospitals, carrying flowers, and expressing words of comfort to those confined therein. Devotional Day was to be the Sunday nearest to March 18th, when each chapter would attend a church as a group. Patriots' Day was planned for May 1st to review the patriotic events of the country and the men and women who gave of themselves that freedom and liberty should be the heritage of each citizen. Education Day was the second regular meeting in September to emphasize the public schools as the bulwark of our liberty and that they must be maintained. Parents' Day was to be observed on the Sunday preceding November 21st to show appreciation of all a boy's parents had done for him by a special meeting to which the parents were to be invited. Land explained to the group that, in his opinion, a national supervisor should be selected to contact and address Masonic bodies regarding the foundation of new chapters. The Grand Council approved his suggestion, but it was not until May that a man with the prominence and the skill of writing and the ability of speaking required for this position could be found. Ray V. Denslow had been active in DeMolay since the first group was formed and now accepted the appointment as ambassador to travel the nation. He was extremely successful in creating interest in DeMolay, and from his efforts hundreds of new chapters were formed. In 1923, however, he resigned his position to accept the positions of Grand Reorder of the Grand Commandery, Knights Templar of Missouri, Grand Secretary of the Grand Chapter, Royal Archmasons of Missouri, and Grand Recorder of the Grand Council, Royal and Select Masters of Missouri. Frank Land had the unique ability of surrounding himself with men of ability. He seemed to look into the future and see the fulfillment of high potential in a man. Ray Denslow was such a man as he rose from national supervision of DeMolay to the highest positions in the Masonic fraternity and was respected in the nation as an author, publisher, exponent of good, and one of the greatest Masonic teacher-researchers of a generation. The formation of a Grand Council gave a central authority for the operation of DeMolay. The designs had been drawn on the Trestle board, but the rapid expansion of the order made it almost impossible to keep up with the work related to new and old chapters, and to keep the new members added each month. By the second annual meeting of the Grand Council in March of 1922, it was reported that 408 new chapters had been formed during the year. Frank Land was now the indefatigable leader of the order. The Scottish Rite provided in their temple a private office and another larger office without charge to the national headquarters of DeMolay. The office staff was small, for in addition to Land, there were only 3 others to conduct the business of the order. Dallas H. Elmore, one of the earliest DeMolays and a past master counselor of Mother Chapter, served as stenographer, took care of the rituals and the multitude of details. 2 men were necessary to hand engrave the large patents of membership used at the time. It was such an inadequate staff for such a large undertaking that Dad Land now looked about for a man to take charge of the office under the title of General Auditor, with power to employ a bookkeeper, clerks, and stenographers to bring order out of disorder. It was almost by accident that Charles A. Boyce was found to fill this position on June 12, 1922. Charlie Boyce was then 35 years old, and one evening walking in the neighborhood of his home at 3604 Montgall, he found Land also out for an evening stroll. The 2 neighbors and fellow lodge members fell into step and casually talked about the affairs of the world and events of mutual interest. Finally Land said, "Charlie, how would you like to come with DeMolay? I need you." The idea and the challenge appealed to Charlie, and even with the realization that he would be earning less money, he said, "I would like to join forces with you." He was ideal for the position so casually offered to him. He had been with the Kansas City Southern Railway in the General Headquarters Office for 16 years in charge of the Auditors of Receipts Office with 153 employees. He was a man of short stature with a friendly smile that seemed always present, a quiet man of great ability. He was to be more than an executive assistant to Frank Land. He was his friend, advisor, and consultant. Much of the growth and spirit of DeMolay is due to this little man of graceful charm, who endeared himself to boys and men in the formative years and growth period of DeMolay. He moved quietly behind the scenes to give order and meaning to the organization. In 1926, on June 16th, he married Gertrude Duncan. As they were returning home from their honeymoon, Charlie said to his bride, "Tomorrow I am going with Frank Land on a tour of the western states and then to a leadership camp at Bear Lake, Colorado. I will be back in September." From early July until September 7th, Charlie saw his bride only for one day. Such was his devotion to Frank Land and DeMolay. Expansion was the very breath of DeMolay. New chapters and enlarged membership demanded an increase in office space and personnel. The small offices so generously provided by the Scottish Rite were now crowded and inadequate. New and larger space was secured on the 12th floor of the Federal Reserve Bank building at 10th and Grand Avenue in Kansas City. Even this was soon outgrown as Land accepted the responsibility of promoting a nationwide program of youth development at the request of President Calvin Coolidge. Eventually, the office space was increased until it occupied the entire west side of the building. The calm, dignified, and capable personality of Land was apparent in the office as under his direction the walls were painted, carpets installed, and the desks arranged to give the feeling of space and dedication. Visitors were impressed by the appearance of the office, the staff, and the courtesy extended. Frank Land was no longer the shy, timid young man of the past, but had grown in stature and in confidence. He was known throughout the nation as the founder and controlling genius of DeMolay. Thousands of boys and men called him Dad. He was under constant pressure to make personal appearances, radio interviews, and to speak to youth groups across the nation. Increasingly, he was away from the office, but no matter where he was, he always made 3 phone calls each day. one to the office, one to his wife, and one to his mother. His mother would end the conversation by saying, "Now, Frankie, you be a good boy." The Kansas City boys at this point felt that they had given Dad land to the nation, but he always seemed available when they needed him. Here was one of the first DeMolays calling on him to tell about the young lady he had met and wanted to marry, but did not have the $25 as a down payment on an engagement ring. "I will be glad to loan you the money, Bill," said Land. "I know the girl. She is just right for you. Congratulations. Pay me when you can." Here was a young minister preaching his first sermon, looking over the congregation and finding Dad seated in the back row and smiling encouragement. Here was young Chris Nungesser giving a talk before the Grand Masters Conference in Washington, D.C., feeling like a young whippersnapper until he saw Dad in the back of the balcony raise his right hand and place his thumb to his forefinger in an age-old symbol of victory, giving full approval to what he was saying. Dad Land never forgot his boys. He seemed to always be where he could give encouragement, advice, or guidance. Countless letters were sent to those graduating from school and to those who had gained some form of recognition. Mother Chapter was always dear to his heart, and when a great youth parade was scheduled for Kansas City, with Brian Washburn, silent movie star, as the leader, he eagerly consented to have the various DeMolay units take part. But the patrol, the 125-piece band with Earl Trowbridge as drum major, and the drill teams were not enough. DeMolay represented knighthood, and how better to show it to the city than to have knights mounted on spirited horses as a part of the parade. He was able to locate 3 outfits of antique armor and to rent 3 horses. He had 2 boys of the chapter who were expert horsemen, Averell Tatlock and Bill Lewis. But how about the 3rd night? Then he saw Gorman McBride in the office. "Gorman," he said, "can you ride a horse?" Gorman had never been closer to a horse than on the merry-go-round of the local amusement park, and that on the stationary horse rather than the carousel animals that went up and down. But to Gorman, if Dad Land said he could ride, he could ride. If Dad Land wanted him for a knight, he could be a knight. So he said, "Sure, I can ride a horse." On the morning of the parade, the 3 boys dressed in the Scottish Rite temple, donning suits of chain-link armor, steel helmets, brilliant colored blazers, and wide belts with heavy scabbards and swords. The horses were waiting, and as the young knights mounted, each was given a lance with a flying pennant to carry. Their place in the parade lineup was blocks away. Tatlock and Lewis turned their mounts and set off at a gallop. Gorman's horse, with herd instinct, dashed off at the same pace to overtake the other 2, but the rider, bouncing up and down with inexperienced horsemanship, first tried to slow down by pulling on the reins. This maneuver failed, so Gorman grasped the saddle horn with both hands with such vigor that the visor of his helmet snapped shut. Still weaving in the saddle and about to be thrown, he leaned forward and threw both of his arms around the neck of the horse. Finally, as his horse came abreast to the others, he heard the sound of metal clashing against his armor. He finally opened the visor of his helmet and saw a young boy, breathless from running, who panted, "Mister, did you all lose your sword? This dropped out on the street 2 blocks back. I ran all the way to give it to you. You all sure ride funny. Good thing that flag is tied on." A slow parade pace gave confidence to 3 mounted knights carrying the insignia of the Crusades and of DeMolay. At the end of the march, the attendant looked at Gorman and his horse, both covered with perspiration and lather, and said, "Boy, you must have had some ride." Gorman, almost falling, answered with, "Dad Land told me I could ride, and I did. Anything Dad Land tells me I can do, I can do." This confidence was shared by the members of the Grand Council for 1923, and the address of the Grand Master, Judge Cochran, an oratory that had swayed countless juries, had this to say. Now, about the Order of DeMolay. What can I say about it? A year ago, the Grand Council met at Kansas City. It was a fine meeting. There were not so many present as there are upon this occasion, because at that time there were not so many deputies appointed. But nevertheless, we met with hearts full of exultation, because the progress of the order at that time had been most marvelous. It had grown up from that little bit of a shoot that peeped above the ground into a majestic tree that spread its branches over the earth in benediction, The tree is still growing. It is a bigger tree, a grander tree, more magnificent in its spreading branches and its giant trunk than it was a year ago. Oh, what wonderful progress has been made in the past year! I have had my part, as my duty required me to have, in connection with that advance. But I do not desire to claim the credit of being more than one whose heart was deeply in the work and who did what fell to his hands to do in promoting a work which has been conducted so ably and with so much wonderful ability by my dear boy, Frank Land, the inspiration of the movement, for it was his brain that first conceived it. It has been his child, his whole heart and time and mind have been devoted to it. I have been to Kansas City oftentimes to our reunions there, and in the performance of other Masonic duties, and always in Frank's room you see his table heaped up with papers and letters, until I could hardly see how it was possible for a man to get through with the work that he got through, because it is not work that you can commit to others. It is work that requires his brain and his heart to make it a success. He can have, and indeed he has, a good office force, not as large perhaps as the excess of work requires, but he has carefully selected them with very great thoughtfulness. But, after all, it is his brain that carries the whole thing along. The office force simply does what he tells it to do. It is he who dictates the letters. It is he who considers the various problems. It is he who takes his satchel, jumps onto the train and hies himself off to Texas or to Oklahoma, or far away into our western country, or again, eastward bound to the majestic city of New York, or to Philadelphia, or to Connecticut, or to New Jersey, where such wondrous work has been done in the development of the DeMolay order since we met a year ago. It is not a question of whether he is leg-weary or brain-weary. It has been a service of heart and soul and conscience, and it has been faithfully performed as it could be by any living human being. I want to say to you, my dear brethren, that Frank is my boy, and I love him. I don't admire him merely, don't like him merely, have not merely a high regard for him, but he has a place way down deep in my heart. I honor and respect him, and I regard him as the great moving impulse which has pressed this order of ours forward and will continue to press it forward as long as he lives. The annual report for 1924 showed a membership of 114,798 with 1,171 active chapters. Land felt the need of ever-increasing activities and had been looking for a competent man to head a department of programs and activities. In Denver, he heard a young man speak in praise of youth at a time when young people were rebelling against the established order to the concern of the older generation. He concluded his speech with, "I am entirely out of sympathy with the pessimistic criticism being made of the young people of today. In my relations with the young folks, I find them to be fully equal, if not superior, to the past generations. They have better opportunities and are taking advantage of them. Of course, there are a certain percentage of young people who waste their opportunities and themselves, but this is also true in the older groups. The dauntless, healthy spirit of youth, properly directed, can and will save any nation against downfall or criminal domination." The speaker was Roy E. Dickerson, a professional youth authority and assistant state secretary of the Young Men's Christian Association in Colorado. He was the author of a book, So Youth May Know, and several research papers on the psychology of the young mind. Land recognized that in Roy Dickerson he had found a professionally trained and nationally known man to carry on an accelerated program of activities. The following day, he called on Dickerson saying, "Roy, we have a youth movement that is growing and will continue to grow, but we need you. You have the training and ability to provide activities that will supplement the ritual and give added meaning to the idealism of DeMolay. We have tried a number of projects, such as a series of leaflets on citizenship prepared by Professor R.V. Harmon of Kansas City and Professor James W. Searson of the University of Nebraska, a magazine called The DeMolay Counselor, and many other activities, including the work of George B. Sykes, a prominent writer and newspaperman, as Director of Publicity. But these are not enough, for there is a gap in our efforts to help each boy become the best man he can become. I would like for you to come to DeMolay and begin your work by developing a program of self-evaluation that will challenge each of our members to review his abilities and how best to develop them in the years before him. You know we are all too rushed, too busy, to calmly sit down and think about where we have been and where we are going. Roy replied, "Of course, you are right. There are too many men who just drift into their life work by chance. It would be great personal help if everyone would take time to occasionally listen to an old hymn, count your many blessings, and then pay heed to the still, small voice within him." "That would be your first assignment," said Frank. "I want each of our members to be a true representative of the order, both now and the years to come. Will you come with us?" Roy responded, "I will be proud to be a member of your staff." Many youth organizations stressed a personal growth based on the qualities of spiritual, mental, physical, and fellowship ideals, but Roy Dickerson wanted to go beyond these and created a program that touched 17 facets of a well-developed personality. These included mental development, reading, current history, self-expression, nature interests, life work, health education, physical development, care of body, physical fitness, manual skill, home relations, self-mastery, religious ideals, chapter loyalty, citizenship, recreational habits, and a statement in answer to the question, "What has DeMolay done for you?" 2 printed forms of questions to be answered were prepared. The first in simple form to give the content of a more elaborate and intensive booklet to list in detail all the points included. A point system for the answer to each question was suggested, not as a final grade, but as a goal of achievement. Each boy was to evaluate himself in this manner, as he graded himself to remind him of the comparative value he placed on each portion of his development. It was, and is, a difficult examination, but in 1924, the first year, 201 boys were given the cherished designation of truly representing the Order of DeMolay. In later years, Roy was to say, "I reached back to the age of chivalry and brought it back to a modern time. You know, in the Middle Ages when a young man was to receive knighthood, he was required to spend the night before the ceremony in contemplation and alone. He retired to a secluded place, often a chapel where he could review his training, his ambitions, and worth as he contemplated a life of service, of humility, and devotion. Even in primitive societies, a boy is required to spend time apart from the tribe before being accepted as a man. Our program has a great tradition from the past. I simply cart it into modern form to fill a neglected need for contemplation on the part of our boys. I know of no other youth group that has such an intensive and inclusive scheme of self-evaluation." The first leadership training camp was attended by many of the first representative DeMolays in late August of 1924. Roy Dickerson had planned the camp with care and had selected Bear Lake, some 10 miles west of Estes Park, Colorado, within the shadow of Long's Peak as the site. Louis Lower, Charles Boyce, Frank Marshall, and a few jurisdiction officers made up the staff to provide class meetings and group discussions. It was such a successful camp that others followed, until in the years before the Depression 4 camps were held: at Camp Nelson Dodd, Brinkhaven, Ohio; Presbyterian Hill, Hollister, Missouri; at Spirit Lake in Iowa, and again the annual camp at Bear Lake. Frank Land was urged to attend this first camp to give his inspiration and strength of purpose to the boys and to take the time to rest in the beauty of the mountains. The strain of his activities had left him exhausted with the sweet tiredness of accomplishment. He found composure and restored confidence in his deep religious faith. His home was a place of comfort, and his wife seemed to bring him the words of encouragement he most needed. In early June, he was glad that he had agreed to Dickerson's request to go to Bear Lake, for one of his deepest disappointments now burst suddenly upon him. The imperial session of the ancient Arabic order of the Nobles of the Mystic Shrine of North America was held in the Orpheum Theater in Kansas City on June 3, 1924. It was a time of strenuous activity on the part of Ararat Temple, serving as host in honor of its past potentate, James E. Chandler, who was to be installed as imperial potentate. Fred O. Wood, as host potentate, called upon Frank Land to have the members of DeMolay serve as pages or aides and to place their drill units and band in the Great Street Parade. This call to service was received with an outpouring of enthusiastic response. It was an opportunity to cooperate with a national meeting and to repay the Masonic world for the help given during the formative years of DeMolay. Even Nell was enlisted to help. She enjoyed the meetings planned for the ladies and drove her car to provide transportation. At the close of the session, she had taken the last guest from the hotel to the railroad station. She returned to her apartment before Frank. He climbed the steps to his apartment, tired, but radiant with the memory of the part his boys and his wife had taken. It was a proud and happy Frank Land returning home with a full flush of triumph, but his feelings were short-lived. He found Nell in tears and listened as she told of a meeting she had with a group of ladies who had called to visit her in the afternoon. "Frankie," she sobbed, "those ladies were rude to me. I served tea to them and entertained them with selections on the piano. They were at first polite, understanding, and gracious. I had a feeling of admiration for them and was proud to have them as friends in our home. And then they told me why they called." Frank listened as the sobs gave place to a determination on her part he had never before seen. "They told me that I was standing in your way. One said you were at the beginning of a great career and that I would only be the girl you had married in your youth. Another dared to suggest that because my parents were born in Poland, that I was a foreigner and not accepted in American society. One dear lady said that because I was not a college graduate, I did not know how to meet people nor how to entertain as I would be called upon to do. They suggested that if I would consent to accept their help and join certain organizations, that I would be acceptable. I thanked them for their good intentions and even drove some of them to the Union Station this evening. But Frank, I will never again take part in their meetings. I love you too much to be a hindrance. I will remain in the background, even though I know that my absence will cause talk and that I shall be lonely when you are away. Oh, Frank, why did this have to be?" Nothing that Frank could say was able to change her decision. This proud, sensitive, and shy person from that time seldom left her apartment and remained in a seclusion of her own choice. She gave her time to the care of a nephew, and on Thursday afternoons her sisters came to her apartment. But she did not become part of Frank's life beyond the walls of their home. It was a tragedy. This gracious and beautiful lady could have given so much of charm to the organization and the people Frank's life touched. Instead, he seldom, if ever, mentioned her, and she became, through the years, a woman of mystery and the least understood of all those who gave themselves to DeMolay.